They built 35 houses on my property while I was deployed overseas, so I opened the floodgates and watched their million-dollar development wash away like a sandcastle. I'm Marcus Thornfield, and I came home from Afghanistan expecting to honor my grandmother's memory on our 47 acres. Instead, I found suburbia, manicured lawns where wildflowers used to dance, pristine driveways where gravel used to crunch under my boots. HOA President Vivian Ashworth smiled like a shark when she told me I was clearly confused about property lines, while standing on land my family had protected since 1887. But here's what Vivian didn't know. Army Corps of Engineers taught me everything about water management, and grandmother's century-old stone dam still controlled every drop flowing through her stolen paradise. She thought she was bullying some confused veteran, but she'd just declared war on someone with federal water authority and a very long memory. What would you do if you came home to find strangers living on your inheritance? Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. This gets wild. My name is Marcus Thornfield, Mac to my friends, 34 years old, fresh off my second tour with the Army Corps of Engineers. My grandmother Delilah raised me on those 47 acres after my parents died, and every morning she'd make me walk the property lines while stirring honey into her coffee. Mac, she'd say, this land doesn't belong to us. We belong to it. The property wasn't just beautiful, it was valuable. 47 acres of prime real estate with a working 1800 stone mill and a dam controlling water flow for 3 counties downstream. Worth $2.3 million. But Grandma never cared about money. Her dying wish was simple: preserve the natural state and never let developers sink their claws into our sanctuary. When I deployed to Afghanistan, everything was perfect. Wildflowers dancing in the breeze, that massive oak tree standing guard over the mill pond, the sweet scent of honeysuckle climbing stone walls. I had simple plans: build a modest cabin, maybe start a family, honor her conservation values. But while I was overseas, someone was building an empire on my inheritance. Enter Vivian Ashworth, 52 and sharp as a switchblade. Real estate developer masquerading as concerned citizen, elected HOA president of adjacent Willowbrook Estates, population 847 residents living in manufactured paradise. Vivian had the perfect setup, married to Bradley Ashworth, township zoning commissioner. Together they'd perfected accidental boundary adjustments, buy property cheap, file creative paperwork, watch your investment magically double in size. The elderly widow down the road lost 12 acres to a surveying error. The disabled veteran by the lake somehow lost waterfront access to emergency protocols. Classic predators targeting the vulnerable. I pulled into what used to be our gravel driveway and found a paved road with a pristine sign: Willowbrook Meadows, private community, residents only. 35 houses worth $340K to $480K each, perfect lawns, matching mailboxes. The air tasted wrong, chemical fertilizer instead of wildflowers, chlorinated pools instead of clean mill water. My grandmother's 200-year-old oak tree was gone, replaced by a tennis court with fresh white lines that felt like a slap across the face. I found Vivian near the community mailboxes, looking exactly like someone who'd stolen 47 acres, perfectly manicured, carrying herself like she owned the world. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice level. "I think there's been a mistake. This is my property, Marcus Thornfield." She looked me up and down like something unpleasant she'd stepped in. "Young man, these families have invested their life savings. You're clearly confused about property lines." I pulled out Grandma's deed with our family name dating to 1887. "No confusion here, ma'am. This is all documented." Vivian smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and produced a folder thick with official papers, complete with township seals. "I think you'll find our survey is more current." The documents looked too legitimate. Every signature perfect, every stamp precisely placed, every boundary line carefully redrawn to erase my inheritance entirely. "And if you continue harassing our residents," she continued, "I'll have no choice but to call police for trespassing." Trespassing. On my own land. The audacity was breathtaking, but the craftsmanship was impressive. This wasn't amateur hour. These people had turned theft into an art form, complete with official stamps and legal language that would fool most courts. That night, I sat in my truck listening to distant air conditioners cooling houses that shouldn't exist, studying falsified papers that somehow made it all legal. the musty smell of old documents mixed with the artificial scent of suburban perfection drifting through my window. I should have been furious. Instead, I smiled, because Vivian Ashworth had no idea she was messing with an engineer who specialized in water management. And that old dam she'd built her subdivision next to? It still worked perfectly. 24 hours later, a process server knocked on my door with a restraining order. Vivian had filed papers claiming I'd harassed residents and disrupted community peace by walking on my own property. The document was impressive, 3 pages describing me as a potentially unstable individual creating fear among peaceful families. Bradley Ashworth had fast-tracked approval, and the local newspaper already ran the story. Troubled veteran threatens peaceful neighborhood. The headline made my jaw clench so hard I heard my teeth grind. That night in the mill, surrounded by grandmother's ledgers, I researched the Ashworth family's history. The musty smell of century-old paper mixed with fresh coffee as I discovered their pattern. This wasn't their first theft. 15 years of targeting military families and elderly widows, always during vulnerable moments. The widow lost 12 acres while her husband was dying. The disabled veteran lost waterfront access during PTSD treatment. My deployment had been their perfect opportunity, but Vivian made a crucial mistake picking an Army Corps engineer to rob. I remembered my training about adverse possession from a legal briefing. It requires continuous open occupation for 7 to 20 years, depending on state law. These houses were built through concealed illegal entry, not legitimate occupation, which meant they had 0 legal standing. I called Rodriguez from my old unit, who connected me with forensic surveyors using military-grade equipment. What they found was beautiful. The houses weren't just on my land, they were blocking federally required drainage easements. Every foundation violated wetlands protection around the mill pond ecosystem. Then I hit the mother lode. The original 1887 deed granted our family perpetual water rights, superseding all local ordinances. Grandfather's great-grandfather had negotiated federal backing for flood control, making those rights untouchable by township manipulation. The real treasure waited in the mill's basement. Behind a loose foundation stone wrapped in oilcloth was grandmother's final letter. Her shaky handwriting revealed everything. Mac, I saw Ashworth surveyors sneaking around last spring, heard Bradley bragging at the diner about his next big development. I documented everything. Photos, recordings of him discussing bribes. If they steal our sanctuary, let the water reclaim it. The envelope contained dozens of photographs showing Ashworth's team surveying my property during deployment, plus audio recordings of Bradley boasting about circumventing environmental protections. Grandmother had conducted her own investigation, gathering evidence like a seasoned detective. The woman who taught me to respect nature had learned to fight corruption with surgical precision. Here's where I turned the tables. While Vivian prepared for her rigged township hearing, I was building a federal case. My engineering background kicked in. Every house represented multiple federal crimes: wetlands destruction, water rights violations, interference with interstate flood control. The diesel smell from construction equipment still lingered around the subdivision, evidence of illegal wetland filling without permits. I spent 3 days transforming the mill into a war room, covered with maps and legal documents. Federal water law became my new specialty, and what I learned changed everything. The Clean Water Act carries penalties up to $37,500 per day per violation. With 35 homes over 18 months, Ashworth was looking at potential fines exceeding $340 million. My old Corps training had covered environmental enforcement, and I remembered thinking those numbers seemed impossibly high. Now they felt like justice. But grandmother's letter planted a different seed. Why fight them in rigged local courts when I could let nature reclaim what was always hers? The mill dam still functioned perfectly, and those federal water rights gave me authority Vivian never suspected existed. Every drop flowing through that spillway was legally mine to control. By Thursday night, I had 2 options: bury Ashworth Development in federal lawsuits for the next decade, or honor grandmother's dying wish more directly. The irony was perfect. While Vivian painted me as an unstable veteran threatening her peaceful community, she had no idea I was sitting on legal authority that could wash her million-dollar development back to the Stone Age. The restraining order hearing was Friday morning. Vivian expected a confused veteran stumbling through township court, probably hoping to settle for nuisance money. Instead, she was about to discover that stealing from a water management engineer was like poking a dam with a stick. Eventually, something's going to give way. I closed grandmother's letter and smiled in the dim mill light. The sound of water flowing over the spillway had never sounded sweeter, like nature itself whispering promises of justice. Tomorrow's hearing would be interesting, but the real show was just beginning. Friday morning's hearing went exactly as Vivian planned, for about 10 minutes. She strutted into township court with a folder thick as a phone book, dabbing prepared tears while painting me as a dangerous veteran threatening innocent families. The judge, clearly bought and paid for, nodded sympathetically as she performed her victim routine. The courthouse coffee tasted bitter, matching the corruption filling that room. Then Vivian overplayed her hand. She filed a civil lawsuit demanding $1.2 million damages, claiming my frivolous boundary dispute was destroying property values. The papers reeked of desperation, accusations of defamation, interference with quiet enjoyment, emotional distress to 35 families. Bradley simultaneously issued building code violations against my mill, demanding $47,000 in emergency safety upgrades or immediate demolition. They were trying to crush me financially before I could mount a real defense. Big mistake. While they were playing small-town politics, I was building a federal case. Thursday evening, I'd called Professor Elena Vasquez from the State University, who'd been tracking Ashworth's wetland violations for environmental law research. Her voice sharpened with excitement when I explained my situation. "Mr. Thornfield, I've been waiting 3 years for someone with standing to challenge these crimes. Your pond provides crucial flood control for 3 downstream communities." She brought devastating news. Ashworth's development had caused last spring's flooding in neighboring towns. 35 houses built on illegally filled wetlands had disrupted natural drainage patterns, sending floodwater where it had never gone before. Each McMansion represented multiple federal violations requiring permits they'd never obtained. I remembered from Corps training that intentional Clean Water Act violations aren't just expensive, they're felonies carrying prison time. The environmental angle unlocked everything. My grandmother's property wasn't just family heritage. It was federally protected watershed habitat serving as critical infrastructure for 50,000 downstream residents. Every house Ashworth built increased flood risk for communities that had no idea their safety was being sold for suburban profit margins. Then something beautiful happened. The community started fighting back. Mrs. Dorothy Flanagan, 78 and sharp as a tack, appeared at my door Sunday morning with cookies and a story that made my hands shake with rage. "Ashworth stole my family farm 5 years ago using identical tactics," she said, her voice carrying decades of suppressed fury. "Falsified surveys, backdated permits, legal threats I couldn't afford to fight. I lost 60 acres, but I kept every document, hoping someone would be strong enough to make them pay." 3 other victims emerged from the shadows with similar stories. The pattern was crystal clear. Target vulnerable people during crisis moments, use legal intimidation to prevent resistance, rely on innocent buyers to unknowingly defend stolen property. But they'd never faced organized opposition backed by federal environmental authority. Tuesday morning brought an anonymous gift, a cashier's check for $25,000 with a note signed, "Grateful Flood Victim." Professor Vasquez explained that downstream communities had been trying to sue for flood damage but couldn't prove causation. My case provided the smoking gun linking illegal development to community destruction. Ashworth's pressure campaign was backfiring magnificently. HOA residents questioned their property titles after media coverage revealed the boundary fraud. Several families discovered their title insurance excluded boundary disputes and acts of government, meaning they'd lose everything if houses were deemed illegal. The acrid smell of panic was replacing suburban perfection as reality sank in. Vivian's aggressive tactics alienated moderate board members who'd assumed the development was legitimate. The township attorney, seeing federal storm clouds gathering, privately advised quiet settlement options before things escalated beyond local control. But Vivian was too arrogant to recognize good advice, doubling down on threats while Professor Vasquez methodically assembled an environmental case that would make federal prosecutors drool. By week's end, everything had changed. The musty mill chamber had become command headquarters for what Professor Vasquez called the most comprehensive environmental justice case in state history. Environmental lawyers, flood victims, theft survivors, and federal investigators were all working toward identical goals: stopping Ashworth's criminal enterprise and restoring stolen property to rightful owners. The sweet irony was delicious. While Vivian fought one confused veteran in rigged township court, she was actually at war with the United States government. Every legal threat she filed created more evidence of obstruction. Every building violation Bradley issued proved conspiracy to interfere with federal environmental enforcement. They were digging their own graves with official township letterhead. That night I stood on the mill's stone steps, listening to water flowing over the spillway, the same sound grandmother had heard for 60 years while protecting this sanctuary. The air smelled clean again, like rain and possibility. Federal authority was gathering like storm clouds, and Vivian Ashworth had no idea the hurricane was about to make landfall. Tomorrow would bring new battles, but tonight I could almost hear grandmother laughing in the wind. Her final letter had been right. Sometimes you have to let the water reclaim what belongs to nature. Wednesday morning I arrived at the mill to find every window smashed and grandmother's antique grain scales destroyed. Someone had spray-painted "terrorist" across the 200-year-old millstone in blood-red letters, while scattering her historical artifacts like broken dreams across stone floors. The sweet honeysuckle scent from outside couldn't mask the acrid stench of hatred inside my family's sanctuary. Vivian escalated immediately. Anonymous calls flooded VA hotlines claiming I was an unstable veteran with explosives access, posing imminent community threats. The caller knew enough military terminology to trigger bureaucratic panic. Within hours, VA security questioned my mental state while requesting voluntary surrender of potentially dangerous materials from Army service. Local news ran, "Dangerous loner threatens families" stories with grainy surveillance photos of me near the mill. Her safety committee demanded police surveillance, claiming residents were too terrified to let children play outside. The courthouse coffee shop buzzed with whispers about the crazy veteran ready to snap. Perfect character assassination, except Vivian had no idea she was handing me the perfect counterattack. While she painted me as unhinged, Professor Vasquez had discovered something beautiful in historical archives. My mill qualified for National Historic Registry protection, representing 200 years of continuous heritage from colonial grain processing through Civil War refuge to Depression-era community center. I remembered from core engineering courses that federal historic preservation automatically triggers environmental review for any nearby construction, something that would halt Ashworth's entire operation. The Historical Society mobilized like warriors. Within 48 hours, volunteers documented every architectural detail while submitting emergency preservation orders to state commissioners. The musty smell of ancient ledgers filled the mill as researchers traced 2 centuries of local significance through yellowed records and faded photographs. Here's where Vivian's greed became her downfall. Professor Vasquez's emergency filing triggered automatic federal review under the National Environmental Policy Act because Bradley had used federal flood control grants to fund construction. Any project receiving federal money requires environmental impact assessment, something he'd forgotten when approving his wife's illegal subdivision. Thursday morning brought federal cavalry. The state preservation officer arrived with archaeological specialists and environmental enforcement officers, took one look at colonial stonework beside Ashworth's wetland destruction, then immediately halted all construction pending comprehensive review. The sharp crack of federal crime scene tape stretching around the property was music to my ears. Bradley panicked beautifully. He called emergency township session with only 3 council members. Others were mysteriously unavailable when notices went out Tuesday evening. The plan was transparent: ram through legislation dissolving historical protections before federal oversight could intervene. Classic small-town corruption, but they'd forgotten about modern documentation. Word spread through our coalition like wildfire. By Thursday evening, the meeting room overflowed with supporters, cameras rolling, federal observers documenting everything. When Bradley gavelled the session open, Professor Vasquez stood with her briefcase of evidence and a smile sharp enough to cut diamonds. "Mr. Ashworth," she announced, voice carrying across the silent room, "this township is under federal environmental investigation for Clean Water Act violations totaling over $15 million in potential penalties. Attempting to interfere with federal preservation orders constitutes obstruction of justice." The room exploded. Reporters shouted questions. Residents demanded explanations. Federal observers photographed every council member, while Professor Vasquez presented documented evidence of illegal wetland destruction, fraudulent environmental statements, and systematic federal regulation violations. Social media erupted instantly. Save Thornfield Mill gained 15,000 supporters in 3 days, with environmental groups from 6 states amplifying the story. Regional television made Historic Mill versus Modern Development their lead story for a week. Property values in Willowbrook Meadows plummeted as buyers learned about federal investigations and title disputes. The intimidation backfired spectacularly. Anonymous death threats only strengthened community resolve. Surveillance cameras caught midnight intruders attempting dam sabotage. Footage federal investigators added to their criminal case. When vandals destroyed Professor Vasquez's car, environmental law students organized protective escorts and 24-hour documentation shifts. My personal stakes had never been higher. VA investigators were still questioning my stability, federal agents were monitoring my every move, and Vivian's smear campaign had half the county convinced I was dangerous. But something unexpected was happening. Instead of isolating me, her attacks were galvanizing unprecedented community support. By Friday evening, volunteers were repairing vandalism damage while coordinating legal strategy and media outreach. The mill chamber hummed with purposeful activity as people who'd never met before worked together protecting something larger than individual property rights. Laughter echoed through ancient stone walls that had witnessed 2 centuries of community gatherings. Standing in the doorway, watching neighbors become environmental warriors, I understood grandmother's true legacy. She hadn't just protected Watershed, she'd created a sanctuary that could inspire communities to fight corruption together. Every attack Vivian launched generated more federal scrutiny, more media attention, more grassroots determination. The irony was perfect. Vivian thought she was silencing one confused veteran, but she'd awakened something infinitely more dangerous, an entire community committed to environmental justice. Her every aggressive move was teaching ordinary people that they could challenge institutional corruption and win. Tomorrow would bring new battles, but tonight belonged to hope. Saturday morning, while researching mill operations, my fingers traced along grandmother's filing cabinet until I found something that stopped my heart. Hidden beneath decades of grain receipts was a 1923 federal document with congressional seals that made my hands shake. The Thornfield Mill Federal Flood Control Agreement granted our family permanent dam authority for downstream protection, not just ownership, but federal jurisdiction superseding all local laws. The aged paper smelled like power and vindication. The language was breathtaking. Emergency clause requiring only 72-hour evacuation notice before controlled water release for ecological restoration. Grandmother hadn't just owned land. She'd held federal water master authority for 3 counties by congressional mandate. Every drop flowing through that spillway was mine to control, untouchable by township politics or HOA lawsuits. I sat in stunned silence as sunlight streamed through broken windows, illuminating the document that would change everything. Professor Vasquez's call Monday morning delivered the second revelation. Her forensic accounting had uncovered criminal conspiracy that made my blood boil. Ashworth had stolen $3.2 million in federal disaster relief grants intended for actual flood victims to fund their illegal development. Money designated for helping communities recover from natural disasters had been laundered through shell companies to build houses on protected wetlands. The paper trail showed fraudulent environmental impact statements filed with EPA to circumvent required permits. The personal betrayal cut deepest. Those federal flood control grants Bradley claimed for emergency watershed management were allocated specifically because flooding damage my family's pond had prevented for generations. Ashworth was stealing money designated to protect the very communities grandmother had been safeguarding through responsible stewardship. They'd turned federal disaster relief into private profit while destroying natural infrastructure that made relief unnecessary. Tuesday afternoon brought federal confirmation that tasted like sweet justice. My core colleague Martinez called with news that made my engineering soul sing. Not only did I possess legal dam authority, but Ashworth had never obtained permits for construction in federally protected flood zones. Outstanding violations totaled over $15 million in potential penalties, with EPA preparing criminal referrals for intentional environmental law destruction. Everything impossible suddenly made sense. 35 houses appeared without oversight because Bradley used fraudulently obtained federal authority to bypass normal permitting. They built on protected wetlands by filing falsified assessments claiming previous development. They stole water rights by convincing agencies that flood control infrastructure was privately owned rather than federally protected. The corruption web was massive, systematic, and completely documented. That evening, I reread grandmother's final letter with new understanding. She'd suspected the scheme months before death, gathering evidence through township insiders uncomfortable with escalating corruption. Her instructions for controlled ecological restoration, weren't revenge fantasy. They were legitimate federal environmental enforcement she'd legally preserved for exactly this moment. The crushing revelation hit me like cold water. Grandmother had contacted Army Corps before her death, ensuring federal authorities knew about illegal development while preserving my standing to challenge it. She deliberately maintained federal water rights registration, paying annual fees most people never knew existed, creating unbreakable legal foundation for environmental protection. Her death hadn't been peaceful surrender. It had been strategic positioning for environmental warfare. Standing in that ancient mill chamber, surrounded by evidence of federal authority and grandmother's tactical brilliance, I felt the entire game shift beneath my feet. This wasn't about fighting Ashworth in rigged local courts anymore. Federal law enforcement had jurisdiction over water rights, environmental crimes, and disaster relief fraud. The taste of possibility was metallic and sharp, like electricity before lightning strikes. My focus crystallized with military precision. The dam release wouldn't be revenge. It would be legal environmental restoration authorized by federal mandate and supported by ecological necessity. Vivian Ashworth was about to learn that stealing from a federal water master carried consequences beyond her worst nightmares. The sound of water flowing over the spillway had never sounded more like justice approaching. The mill became our war room overnight. Ancient stone walls that had ground grain for 2 centuries now displayed environmental maps and federal documents, while the rich aroma of fresh coffee mixed with musty timber as our coalition gathered. Professor Vasquez arrived with graduate students carrying modeling software, but the real game changer walked in Tuesday morning. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez from my old unit, grinning like he'd been waiting years for this kind of righteous payback operation. "Mac, you always did like playing with water," he laughed, studying the dam mechanism with professional appreciation. "Time to show these civilians what Army Corps engineering can really do." His hydraulic expertise transformed amateur planning into military precision, calculating controlled flood scenarios that would restore wetlands without endangering innocent lives. The federal coordination was beautiful to watch unfold. Professor Vasquez had convinced EPA to treat our operation as legitimate ecological restoration, not property revenge. Federal marshals prepared to serve simultaneous warrants during environmental remediation, while state environmental crimes units stood ready with fraud charges. The sweet taste of institutional support felt like victory before the battle even began. We spent 3 sleepless days calculating every variable. Dam release had to restore natural drainage patterns while minimizing structural damage to homes built by families who'd trusted corrupt developers. Rodriguez's engineering background proved invaluable as we modeled water flow, evacuation routes, and timing sequences. The 72-hour evacuation notice would arrive via certified mail, with legitimate disaster relief organizations providing temporary housing, not Ashworth's corrupt shell companies. Environmental monitoring equipment transformed the mill into scientific command center. University sensors positioned throughout the watershed would document ecosystem recovery in real time, providing irrefutable evidence that ecological restoration benefited entire region. I remembered from Corps training that environmental projects needed comprehensive documentation, not just for legal protection, but to prove community benefits outweighed individual losses. The legal framework was devastating in its simplicity. Clean Water Act violations carried $37,500 daily penalties per violation. 35 homes over 18 months meant Ashworth faced potential fines exceeding $340 million. Federal environmental restoration immunity prevented local interference, while environmental insurance excluded acts of government coverage, leaving developers personally liable for illegal construction costs. Community mobilization exceeded every expectation. Historical Society volunteers worked around the clock documenting mill artifacts before flooding, their dedication proving this was about preserving heritage, not destroying property. Environmental groups coordinated media campaigns highlighting ecosystem benefits, while downstream communities testified about flood protection advantages. Veterans organizations rallied behind their fellow soldier protecting homeland. The mill chamber hummed with purposeful energy as strangers became environmental warriors. Media strategy required surgical precision. Documentary crews would film ecological restoration as environmental victory rather than personal vendetta. Social media campaigns reframed narrative from dangerous veteran to community environmental champion. Regional newspapers received exclusive federal investigation access, while television prepared exposé series on regional development corruption. The sharp click of cameras became soundtrack of approaching justice. Personal preparation meant honoring grandmother's teachings through methods she'd used for 60 years. Her environmental journals read like military intelligence, documenting seasonal patterns and wildlife migration routes that would guide restoration timing. Local historians taught me traditional mill operations, connecting modern environmental engineering with centuries of sustainable water management. The musty smell of her handwritten notes filled my nostrils as I studied decades of careful ecosystem observation. Alliance coordination required military-style operational security. Weekly strategy meetings used encrypted communications while legal observers positioned for all proceedings. Backup plans covered potential Ashworth sabotage attempts, including federal protection protocols if desperation turned violent. The rhythmic scratch of pencils on engineering paper during planning sessions sounded like artillery preparation for environmental warfare. The countdown began with precision that would impress any commanding officer. Certified mail notices delivered simultaneously to 35 households, explaining legal authority and safety procedures with military clarity. Federal authorities positioned to prevent interference while restoration equipment staged for immediate ecosystem rehabilitation. Media crews granted exclusive access to document historic recovery that would set national precedent for community environmental protection. Something profound was happening beyond tactical planning. I'd evolved from isolated victim to regional environmental leader, channeling military training into civilian conservation victory. Professor Vasquez emerged as passionate ecosystem advocate, translating academic expertise into practical legal warfare. Grandmother's wisdom guided every decision through preserved journals that read like strategic intelligence for fighting institutional corruption. By Sunday evening, all pieces aligned perfectly. The mill vibrated with coordinated preparation as volunteers completed final staging for what Professor Vasquez called the most significant grassroots environmental restoration in state history. Federal support, legal documentation, scientific justification, media coverage, and community backing had converged like precision bombing coordinates on Ashworth's criminal enterprise. Standing on mill steps that final night, listening to water flow over spillway that would soon reclaim stolen sanctuary, I felt grandmother's spirit in the cool breeze carrying sense of approaching rain and wild possibilities. Her journals lay open on ancient grain tables, 6 decades of environmental stewardship ready to guide tomorrow's restoration. The satisfying splash of equipment testing echoed across the pond as we prepared to let nature reclaim what corrupt developers had stolen from future generations. Monday morning, I walked into the mill and found Rodriguez laughing like a man who just won the lottery. "Mac, you're not going to believe this," he said, holding up a small recording device. "Bradley Ashworth just tried bribing me with $50,000 cash to sabotage your dam operation." The FBI had wired Rodriguez Sunday night after intelligence suggested Ashworth was planning desperate moves, and every word of attempted bribery was captured in crystal-clear audio that would make federal prosecutors weep with joy. The recording was devastating. Bradley's nervous voice offering cash payments for overlooking environmental irregularities, promising township consulting contracts if Rodriguez would convince me to be reasonable about boundaries, even describing potential accidents that could happen to federal investigators. The metallic taste of vindication filled my mouth as agents played back conversations proving 15 years of systematic corruption through fraudulent development schemes. But Vivian wasn't finished destroying herself. She organized emergency HOA meetings, authorizing private security forces to protect community assets from terrorist threats. Suddenly, tactical gear contractors were patrolling suburban streets like occupying army, harassing anyone with cameras or environmental equipment. The sharp crack of zip ties and aggressive shouting replaced children's laughter in what used to be peaceful neighborhood, proving Ashworth's desperation had crossed into criminal intimidation territory. Her federal injunction filing read like paranoid fantasy. Legal papers described me as domestic terrorist with explosive training, planning to weaponize water systems against innocent families. The documents claimed dam release would constitute eco-terrorism, requiring federal intervention to prevent catastrophic destruction. Reading those delusional accusations felt surreal. Here was a woman whose family had stolen disaster relief funds accusing me of threatening community safety. Federal response was swift and merciless. FBI Financial Crimes Unit uncovered systematic theft dating back 15 years, with bank records showing $400,000 in illegal campaign contributions to township officials. Grand jury convened for environmental crimes and corruption charges that would imprison the entire Ashworth network for decades. The sweet scent of approaching justice was finally overpowering the stench of suburban corruption that had poisoned our community. Our resistance network proved invaluable. Military contacts provided surveillance detection training while Professor Vasquez's colleagues monitored Ashworth's legal maneuvers through academic research channels. Environmental groups documented every harassment incident for federal prosecutors, creating evidence files that grew thicker daily. The underground coordination felt like resistance movement, citizens fighting institutional corruption through organized, peaceful defiance. The community siege intensified beyond recognition. Private contractors followed coalition members' children to school, photographed families during routine activities, even poisoned pets belonging to environmental supporters. Anonymous threats escalated to property destruction targeting anyone supporting restoration, slashed tires, broken windows, spray-painted threats that turned suburbia into war zone. Several terrified HOA residents secretly requested relocation assistance, afraid of living in community controlled by increasingly desperate criminals. Media warfare reached unprecedented intensity. Ashworth's million-dollar PR campaign spread fabricated stories about my military service, claiming PTSD episodes and violent incidents that never happened. Professional opposition researchers targeted every coalition member with character assassination designed to discredit federal investigation through personal destruction. The lies were sophisticated, expensive, and temporarily effective until documented evidence of environmental crimes overwhelmed manufactured propaganda. Social media became digital battlefield. #SaveThornfield, mill trending nationally, brought environmental supporters from every state, while Ashworth's paid trolls spread disinformation about government overreach and property rights. The online war was fierce, but truth carries momentum that money cannot manufacture. Photographic evidence of ecological destruction defeats expensive lies when given sufficient exposure. Personal stakes reached terrifying heights when death threats required federal protection. Intercepted communications revealed plans for accidents targeting key supporters, forcing FBI to assign protective details during ongoing investigation. Professor Vasquez faced political pressure from development industry donors, while elderly coalition members suffered health impacts from constant stress and intimidation. The smell of fear was becoming tangible in our once peaceful community. Thursday evening brought the breaking point that changed everything. Federal agents arrested 3 Ashworth contractors attempting to sabotage dam mechanisms using explosive devices that could have caused catastrophic flooding. The plan was diabolically simple: trigger massive flood damage, then blame environmental activists for reckless water release endangering thousands of innocent lives. Evidence seized during arrests proved conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism for financial gain. Standing in the mill that night while investigators processed explosive evidence, I felt profound shift in our struggle's nature. This wasn't about property disputes anymore. Ashworth's willingness to endanger entire communities proved we were fighting cornered criminals capable of mass destruction to protect illegal profits. The acrid smell of bomb-sniffing dogs and crime scene tape filled ancient stone chambers as federal agents documented terrorism charges that would end Ashworth's reign permanently. Looking at Professor Vasquez coordinating with federal agents, watching community members volunteer for protective duty despite personal danger, I realized something remarkable had happened. Ashworth's escalating attacks had transformed individual property dispute into regional environmental justice movement. Every desperate criminal act generated more federal attention, more community solidarity, more determination to protect natural heritage from corporate predators. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight belonged to quiet satisfaction. Ashworth had just handed federal prosecutors everything needed for terrorism convictions that would guarantee decades behind bars. Friday morning, I woke to the sound of helicopters circling the mill. Bradley had triggered his nuclear option, emergency township powers declaring my mill an imminent public safety threat requiring immediate demolition. County sheriff and state police were mobilizing for emergency action within hours, armed with fabricated structural reports claiming dam failure could kill thousands. The documents looked official enough to fool most people, complete with forged engineering signatures and falsified safety assessments. But Ashworth's desperation had led to a fatal overreach. They'd coordinated with corrupt state official Rebecca Morrison to revoke my federal water rights, claiming national security concerns invalidated century-old agreements. Morrison's emergency order attempted stripping my dam authority, alleging terrorist threats had voided federal protection. The bitter taste of institutional betrayal filled my mouth as I realized how deep the corruption reached. They were willing to destroy democracy itself to protect their criminal profits. The federal hammer fell like lightning. Army Corps of Engineers assumed direct control within 3 hours, uniformed personnel establishing security perimeter around mill complex, while EPA declared Willowbrook Meadows a federal crime scene. Local jurisdiction evaporated instantly as FBI command post materialized in my mill chamber, transforming grandmother's sanctuary into federal law enforcement headquarters. The sharp sound of military radios and federal authority was music to my ears. Evidence seizure revealed criminal conspiracy beyond imagination. Raided offices yielded documents proving systematic fraud across 47 developments spanning 6 counties, with stolen federal funds exceeding $12 million. Bank records exposed money laundering through legitimate businesses, while communications intercepts captured recorded conversations, planning infrastructure attacks and federal officer assassination. Former employees testified about illegal dumping, permit fraud, and organized intimidation campaigns that had terrorized communities for decades. The arrests were poetry in motion. Federal agents caught Bradley destroying township records red-handed, shredded documents, and wiped drives proving obstruction of justice. Vivian's capture was even sweeter. Apprehended at airport with suitcases full of cash and false identification while fleeing to non-extradition territory. The look of shocked disbelief on her face when handcuffs clicked was worth every sleepless night she'd caused our community. Community response exceeded every expectation. 1,000-person march surrounded mill complex, preventing demolition through sheer human presence, while national environmental organizations provided legal support. Congressional representatives demanded hearings on rural development corruption as downstream flood victims testified about ecosystem damage. HOA residents filed class action lawsuits seeking recovery of investments stolen through criminal deception, finally understanding they'd been victims, not beneficiaries, of Ashworth's scheme. Media explosion transformed local property dispute into national environmental justice symbol. Network news covered David versus Goliath story resonating across political spectrum, while documentary footage of Ashworth arrests became viral sensation. Social media campaign reached 500,000 supporters, generating congressional pressure for industry-wide corruption investigation. The sweet satisfaction of watching lies crumble under documented truth was intoxicating. Federal victory felt surreal after months of desperate struggle. Court granted permanent mill protection while EPA designated restoration as national priority project. Army Corps authorized controlled flooding for ecological rehabilitation, providing federal backing for Operation Ashworth had branded domestic terrorism. Congressional appropriation delivered $2.8 million for comprehensive restoration, transforming personal revenge into legitimate environmental science. Personal recognition transcended individual vindication. Federal environmental hero designation meant less than watching Professor Vasquez appointed to Wetlands Advisory Committee, knowing lasting change was possible. Grandmother's Mill receiving National Historic Landmark status honored 6 decades of stewardship while establishing permanent development protection. Community's annual environmental festival would celebrate victory over corruption for generations. But the real triumph was watching our resistance network transform into permanent environmental movement. Underground communications had become legitimate advocacy organization. Coalition members were running for township offices, determined to prevent future corruption. Federal prosecutors were using our case as model for environmental enforcement nationwide. What started as personal property dispute had evolved into regional conservation revolution. The 48-hour countdown began with ceremonial precision. Federal disaster coordination ensured resident safety during controlled restoration, while environmental monitoring documented historic ecosystem recovery. Media access was granted to witness precedent-setting project that would guide community conservation efforts across America. The rhythmic splash of pre-release testing sounded like victory bells announcing nature's approaching triumph. Standing in mill doorway that final evening, watching federal agents coordinate with community volunteers while Professor Vasquez reviewed restoration protocols, I felt overwhelming gratitude for grandmother's strategic brilliance. Her environmental journals guided federal project that would restore stolen wetlands while establishing national precedent for grassroots conservation. The warm evening air carried sense of approaching storm and unlimited possibilities. Tomorrow would witness controlled flood washing away suburban corruption while restoring natural heritage to rightful state. But tonight belonged to quiet reflection on journey from isolated victim to environmental champion. Ashworth's criminal empire was destroyed, federal enforcement was strengthened, and ordinary citizens had proven they could defeat institutional corruption through organized resistance. The sound of water flowing over spillway had never promised such perfect justice. Tomorrow, that gentle flow would become roaring flood of environmental restoration, washing Ashworth's stolen paradise back to nature where it belonged. Saturday morning broke with electric anticipation as 800 people gathered around the mill for what everyone knew would be historic. Environmental supporters from 6 states, federal officials in crisp uniforms, and media crews with enough equipment to broadcast the Super Bowl-created festival atmosphere around grandmother's ancient sanctuary. The sweet scent of wildflowers mixed with fresh coffee and nervous excitement as volunteers finished setting up speakers that would carry this moment across the region. Then came the entrance everyone had been waiting for. Vivian Ashworth stepped out of a federal transport van in orange jumpsuit and shackles, her perfectly manicured facade replaced by the hollow look of someone whose empire had crumbled overnight. The contrast was breathtaking. A woman who'd commanded suburban paradise now shuffling through crowds of people she'd tried to destroy. 800 pairs of eyes watched her public humiliation unfold like karma finally collecting its debt. Army Corps Colonel Patricia Williams presented my Environmental Stewardship Medal while 2.3 million viewers watched live coverage. Marcus Thornfield represents citizen environmental protection at its finest, she announced, her voice carrying across the crowd like thunder. His courage fighting institutional corruption has strengthened federal enforcement nationwide. The applause was deafening, echoing off stone walls that had witnessed 2 centuries of community gatherings but never anything like this. But the moment everyone craved belonged to Vivian's court-mandated confession. Federal judge had required her to read victim impact statement acknowledging crimes before the community she'd terrorized. Her voice cracked as she admitted stealing disaster relief funds, filing fraudulent reports, and destroying protected wetlands for profit. Every word was broadcast live, creating permanent record of admission that would follow her through decades behind bars. The microphone felt warm in my hands as I stepped forward for response I'd rehearsed in my dreams. "Mrs. Ashworth," I said, letting silence build while cameras captured her broken expression. "You built your dream on our nightmare. You stole from flood victims and veterans while destroying heritage that belonged to future generations. Today, nature reclaims what was always hers." I paused, watching tears stream down her face before delivering the line that would become legend. "And I hope every drop of this water reminds you that some things are too sacred to steal." The crowd erupted like victory celebration at the World Series. Cheers echoed across the valley while federal officials nodded approval and media crews captured every second of environmental justice being served hot and fresh. The taste of vindication was sweeter than anything I'd ever experienced, watching someone who'd wielded power like a weapon finally face consequences for her crimes. Professor Vasquez joined me at the ceremonial dam release, our hands positioned together on the lever that would restore stolen wetlands. Federal countdown from 10 had the crowd holding its breath while cameras from major networks captured history unfolding. The metallic click of engagement was followed by the most beautiful sound in the world, water roaring through channels that hadn't flowed freely since Ashworth's theft began. The spectacle was pure magic. Water flowed majestically through restored paths, avoiding residential areas with scientific precision while reclaiming illegally filled wetlands like nature taking back stolen property. Within hours, wildlife returned as if they'd been waiting in the wings. Great blue herons landing in emerging marshland, painted turtles surfacing in expanding ponds, schools of fish appearing in restored habitat like environmental resurrection. Media response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media live stream peaked at 1.2 million simultaneous viewers as #LetNature. Reclaim trended nationally. Environmental groups called it precedent for grassroots conservation, while legal experts praised federal coordination for ecosystem justice. News anchors struggled to capture the emotional weight of watching suburban development wash away to reveal ancient wetland paradise underneath. Law enforcement presence felt like protective embrace rather than crowd control. Federal marshals ensured peaceful proceedings while state environmental crimes officers served final warrants during public ceremony, adding legal drama to environmental celebration. Congressional representatives attended to support federal enforcement, lending political weight to community victory that resonated far beyond our valley. The symbolic victory transcended environmental restoration. 200-year-old mill wheel turned again as natural flow returned, connecting modern conservation to centuries of sustainable stewardship. Grandmother's wildflowers bloomed immediately in restored soil, proving ecosystem memory survives human interference. Children waited in marshland where million-dollar houses had stood 48 hours earlier, experiencing wilderness their grandparents thought was lost forever. Evening brought quiet satisfaction as crowds dispersed and federal teams documented successful restoration. Environmental Education Center would open in the mill, teaching conservation to future generations while Professor Vasquez's research guided similar projects nationwide. Ashworth's prosecution would deter environmental criminals for decades, creating legal precedent protecting communities from development fraud. Standing on mill steps that night, listening to restored water flowing naturally for the first time in years, I felt grandmother's spirit in every ripple carrying moonlight toward the sea. Her conservation legacy had evolved from family heritage to national model, proving ordinary citizens could protect natural inheritance from corporate predators through courage, community, and federal partnership. The sound of justice flowing free was the sweetest lullaby imaginable, promising that some victories echo through generations, like water, finding its ancient course home. 6 months later, the Thornfield Mill Environmental Education Center opened with 5,000 visitors celebrating the most successful grassroots conservation victory in state history. Children's laughter echoed across restored wetlands as they paddled canoes where McMansions once stood, their joy mixing with birdsong that had returned to fill grandmother's sanctuary. The sweet scent of wildflowers bloomed where tennis courts had scarred ancient soil, proving nature's incredible power to heal when given the chance. The mill itself transformed into living classroom where my wife, Dr. Elena Thornfield, after our spring wedding, taught environmental law to students nationwide. Our love story had grown from professional alliance fighting corruption to personal partnership protecting natural heritage for future generations. The musty smell of centuries-old timber now mixed with fresh flowers from our wedding bouquet, pressed and preserved in grandmother's grain bins like promises kept across generations. Former HOA residents found unexpected redemption through environmental stewardship. Monthly support groups for development fraud victims met in the mill chamber, sharing healing stories while building communities stronger than any subdivision. Township adopted America's strictest environmental protections, with former victims serving as guardians ensuring corruption could never poison our valley again. The bitter taste of betrayal had transformed into sweet satisfaction of empowered citizenship. Federal restitution delivered justice beyond imagination. Ashworth family assets totaling $4.2 million compensated fraud victims, with each defrauded homeowner receiving $340,000 for their losses. My settlement funded the Delilah Thornfield Conservation Scholarship, supporting military veterans pursuing environmental careers. The endowment grew to $2.1 million, honoring grandmother's legacy through 50 annual scholarships that turned her wisdom into living action. Environmental impact exceeded every scientific prediction. Restored wetlands became state-designated critical habitat where endangered species thrived, with water quality improvements documented throughout 3 counties. Natural flood control had already prevented millions in storm damage, while international recognition came when the United Nations featured our restoration as global model for community-led environmental justice. Legal precedent proved equally transformative. Congressional Environmental Justice and Development Act created $50 million federal fund inspired by our victory, protecting rural communities from development fraud nationwide. Federal prosecutors used Ashworth convictions as enforcement template, winning 23 similar cases where communities successfully challenged corrupt developers through organized resistance and federal partnership. Personal healing brought the most unexpected joy. Elena and I were expecting our first child, due when spring wildflowers would bloom again in grandmother's meadows. Mill Daycare would teach next-generation environmental stewardship, while renewable energy systems powered education programs through sustainable sources. The sound of children learning conservation where corruption once flourished felt like perfect circles closing with hope. Presidential Environmental Hero Awards ceremony at the mill last month brought national recognition for proving ordinary citizens could defeat institutional corruption. Smithsonian Environmental Museum acquired grandmother's journals, preserving 60 years of ecological wisdom for future study. Documentary The Mill That Stopped the Developers won environmental awards while becoming required viewing in federal enforcement training. 5-year anniversary celebration drew 12,000 supporters witnessing transformation that inspired communities worldwide. Children who'd learned swimming in restored ponds now taught environmental conservation to younger students, creating multi-generational protection legacy. Former adversaries joined festivities, acknowledging ecosystem restoration benefited entire region through improved water quality and flood control. The community benefit that meant most was establishing the Delilah Thornfield Nature Preserve, 847 acres of protected wetlands and forests surrounding the mill, ensuring development could never threaten our sanctuary again. Educational programs served 15,000 students annually, while research from our site guided conservation across 3 states. Economic impact reached $15 million yearly through environmental tourism, bringing families to experience restored paradise. But true victory was proving environmental protection and community healing could triumph over corporate greed. Standing on mill steps each morning, listening to water flow naturally through channels grandmother protected for 60 years, I felt her spirit in every ripple carrying life toward tomorrow. Her conservation wisdom had evolved from family tradition to national inspiration, demonstrating that shared legacies grow stronger when defended together. The warmth of community support, the satisfaction of justice served, and the promise of protected wilderness for my unborn child created happiness grandmother would have treasured. Every sunrise over restored wetlands proved some battles are worth fighting, some heritage is worth protecting, and some victories echo through generations like water finding its ancient course home. Now it's your turn. Drop a comment sharing your own HOA nightmare story. You're not alone fighting corrupt neighbors who think rules don't apply to them. Hit subscribe to Karen Stories and ring that notification bell for more justice victories, because next week we're covering how a small town stopped a casino from draining their lake. The legal twist that saved 200 jobs will absolutely blow your mind.